therefore, we are going to divide the chapters into sections and then in subsection. So this is subsection 1.1, in which we are going to study about changes. Now, no matter where you are or what you are doing, the world around you keeps on changing. Whether it is plant growing, logs burning, milk changing to curd, or even if you are just eating or respiring, everything keeps on changing. In chemistry, we would mark these changes as physical change and chemical change. So first of all, let us talk about physical change. Okay, so whenever you want to understand any term, try to find out the literal meaning of that term. So we are talking about physical change, right? So physical change will be change in the physical property of any of the substance. That physical property could be its size, it could be its shape or its form. Okay, now in physical change there is no new substance formed, and the reason is that the molecules are only rearranged. Okay, and that is why you cannot say that new molecules are formed, and therefore no new substance is formed in physical change. So these are certain examples of physical change. Number one is when the water is converting into ice at a temperature above 0 degrees Celsius and it's converting into water vapors at a temperature above 100 degrees Celsius. Now here all the molecules will be H2O only, even if there is change in state. Okay, so the things will be all water molecules only. Now the second is sugar and water solution. So when you dissolve sugar into water, you will get sugar water solution, and the property will be same, it won't be different. So, and you can also get sugar back from the water by the help of distillation method. So we can say that again it's a physical change. Now here this is a third example in which this glass is broken into, suppose, millions of pieces. Now even if you take a small piece of glass here, it would be again glass. The properties haven't changed, and that is why it is a physical change. Now here, suppose this cloth is cut into many pieces. Again, if you take any of the piece, it will be again cloth. Yeah, so it would be made of the same thing, and that is why it would be a physical change. Now I will tell you about physical change at molecular level. So right now you have a substance 1 which consists of 3 molecules. So suppose this is molecule number 1, molecule number 2 and molecule number 3. Okay, now the substance is undergoing physical change. So see what will happen. After physical change, you can see that the molecules are only rearranged. It's not like that in this first molecule some other atom is also added, right? The molecules are only rearranged. That is what happens in physical change, that there is no insertion or deletion of atoms. The molecules are just rearranged, and that is why we can say that no new substance is formed. Okay. Now next is chemical change. So what happens in chemical change? Now the literal meaning would be change in the chemical properties of a substance, right? So in chemical change, the properties of a substance changes, and you can see that there is change in color, change in temperature, there are releases of some gases, or there are some sound or light effects. Okay. Now in chemical change, the atoms get rearranged. What happens is that the bonds between the molecules breaks and the atoms get free, and then they combine with each other in such a form that new molecules are formed, and therefore you can say that in chemical change new substances are formed, and the property of the new substance is totally different to the property of the original substance. Okay, so these are some of the examples of chemical change which I will be elaborating just in a few minutes. Okay, so this is cooking of food, rusting of iron, souring of milk, fermentation of grapes, digestion of food, and respiration. These are very important because they are also mentioned in NCERT. So we will have a good look on these examples. Okay. Now suppose this substance is undergoing a chemical change. Now the substance is made up of 3 molecules. Molecule number 1, molecule number 2 and molecule number 3. So now when it will be undergoing a chemical change, first of all the bonds which are there in between these atoms, they will break down, and we will have these free atoms all together here. So molecule number 1 is disintegrated into 2 atoms here, molecule number 2 is again disintegrated here, and molecule number 3 is also disintegrated here. Now what happens is these atoms will be rearranged in order to form new molecules all together, and a new substance will be formed thereafter. Okay, So this substance is altogether a new substance, because you can see that here altogether new molecules are formed. Okay, so what happens in chemical change? In chemical change, you have rearrangement of atoms which give rise to making of new molecules, and thus new substances form whose property is completely different to the property of the original substance. Now these are the examples of chemical change. First is souring of milk. Now let me tell you that milk contains a sugary component which is called lactose. Okay, and it also contains harmless bacteria which is lactobacillus. Now under required temperature, what happens is this lactobacillus starts to eat lactose as an energy source, and it converts lactose into lactic acid. Okay, so like any other acid, lactic acid is sour in taste. That is why milk, when kept in room temperature for a longer period of time, gets sour. Okay, next is rusting of iron. Now suppose this is iron. Okay, this is pure iron which is consisting of only iron atoms. Now what happens is, during humid atmosphere, when the content of water is very high in air, so this iron gets the coating of Fe2O3.XH2O. This is called rust, which is orange in color. Okay, so this pure iron gets covered with rust here. Okay, what happens is iron reacts with water present in the air and the oxygen present in the air and forms rust. The property of rust is different to the property of the pure iron, and that is why we can say that a chemical change has occurred. Next is fermentation of grapes. So what is fermentation? Fermentation means a breaking down of any substance by the action of microorganisms like yeast or bacteria. So now in fermentation of grapes is that the grapes is crushed and it is pressed. Then what happens is that the yeast starts to eat this crushed grapes under anaerobic condition. Anaerobic means without oxygen. Okay, when there is no oxygen, yeast try to eat up this grapes and converts glucose present in the grapes to alcohol. So glucose which is present in the grapes is converted into alcohol under anaerobic condition, and we can say that the grapes has fermented. Okay, next is cooking of food. So what happens is that the food which we intake is basically vegetables or pulses, etc. Okay, and we add additives like oil, butter, and we actually heat the vegetables or pulses. Now what happens is that the chemical composition of this vegetable changes. Okay, there is breakdown of the chemical substance present in this, and you get the cooked food as an output. Okay, and the property of this cooked food is entirely different to the property of this raw vegetables and pulses. Now next is digestion of food. So the food which you intake consists of fats, carbohydrates and proteins. So these are macromolecules which cannot be easily absorbed by our body. So we have enzymes in stomach and intestine. So these enzymes break down these macromolecules into simpler substances. So they convert fats into fatty acids, carbohydrates are converted into glucose, and proteins are converted into amino acids. Okay. So these simpler molecules can be easily absorbed by our body, and that is why we say the digestion of a food in our body is a chemical change. Now respiration. Now respiration and breathing, they are two different terms. So breathing is a physical process in which you take in oxygen and gives out carbon dioxide, whereas respiration is a chemical process. So you have a cell here which is present in your body, right? So this glucose present in the cell combines with the oxygen, and it gives out energy, carbon dioxide and water. So because of this, we can say that a chemical change has occurred. Now next we are going to understand about the difference between a chemical change and a physical change. So this topic is very important from exam point of view. The difference between physical change and chemical change. In physical change, the molecules are rearranged and therefore no new substance is formed. Whereas in chemical change, the molecules get broken down into their respective atoms and therefore a new substance is formed. Now in physical change, no energy is generated. Whereas in chemical change, the energy is absorbed in the form of heat and sometimes it is released in the form of heat or gases. Okay. Now in physical change, as I told you, that there is change only in the physical property of a substance, its size, shape and state, whereas in chemical change you have changes in both physical as well as chemical property of the substance, and hence a new kind of substance is formed. Okay, now in physical change there is no change in mass. Suppose you have a ice here which is converted into water. So the mass of this ice will be equivalent to the mass of this water. Whereas in chemical change, the mass of constituents may change. Suppose you have a wax candle here, okay, and if you burn it, so after some times it will start melting and it will start vaporizing, and you will have a small amount of wax left. Now what happens is, this wax is converted into water vapors and carbon dioxide. Okay, so you can say that in chemical change the mass of constituents may change but the total mass remains the same. So this is the takeaway point from this session, that in physical change there is only rearrangement of molecules, there are no new molecules formed, and that is why no new substance is formed. Whereas in chemical change it is rearrangement of atoms. These atoms rearranges in order to form new molecules, and thus new substances formed. So now is the time to check what we have studied so far. Okay, so these are certain questions which are very important from both point of view. So just take 5 minutes in order to think about these questions and write them in your own words, and then we are going to discuss it. Okay, so let us discuss these questions here. Now, burning of wax, what do you think? Is it a physical change or a chemical change? Yes, it is a chemical change. Why? Because in this, the wax is converting into wax vapors, and wax vapors combines with oxygen in order to form carbon dioxide and water vapors. So it's a chemical change. Now talking about melting of wax, it will be a physical change. So the wax which is in solid is converted into liquid. So that is a physical change. What about fermentation of fruit juice? It would be a chemical change. Why? Because the fruit juice is basically being eaten up by yeast under an aerobic condition, and the glucose present in the fruit juice is converted into alcohol. That is why it is a chemical change. Diluting of fruit juice, again you are adding water to fruit juice, so you can separate out fruit juice from the water, so you can say that it's a physical change, because adding water is not changing the property of the fruit juice. Now rusting of iron, we have discussed before, it is a chemical change because we have rust form, and the property of the rust is different from the property of pure iron. Now this is melting of iron, it is a physical change because the solid iron is converted into liquid iron. Okay, now second is, the grapes hanging on the plants do not ferment, but when they are plucked from the plant they can be fermented. Under what conditions do these grapes ferment? Is it a chemical change or a physical change? So when the grapes are hung to the plant, so grapes are living at that time, so that is why their immune system avoids fermentation. However, when they are plucked from the plants, so in anaerobic condition, they are eaten up by yeast and other microorganisms and they get fermented. Okay, so it would be a chemical change therefore. Now state one difference, again I told you physical change will be rearrangement of molecules, and therefore no new substance is formed, whereas chemical change is rearrangement of atoms and hence new substance is formed. Now last question, why digestion of food is considered as chemical process? It is considered a chemical process because the macromolecules which we intake is broken down into simpler molecules so that they can be easily absorbed by our body, and that is why digestion of food is a chemical process. So we have done with this topic, physical change and chemical change. If you have any problem, do write me on the comment section. I've answered to any of the problems which you are having. Now in the next video, we are going to understand about chemical reactions and chemical equations. Till then, bye bye.